coming at the end of such a rich and fertile panel makes me aware that my main function is to keep the audience awake and in their seats, and I'm not expected to add anything substantive. But it's been, I want to say make a provocative remark at the outset, which is that none of us have taken notice, although Mazen alluded to it at the end of his talk, to the fact that West Asia is the most vulnerable region in the world to global warming. And the preoccupation with the current agenda has a terribly dangerous effect of totally distracting both the people in the region and those that are concerned about the region with this impending ecological catastrophe from the perspective of rising sea levels, water scarcity. Yemen, for instance, is supposed to be the most water-challenged country in the world. And it can't conceive of these issues under the kind of pressure that it exists under. Saudi Arabia has played a terribly destructive role in climate change negotiations because it doesn't want to do anything that impairs the use and reliance on oil. And therefore, it has tried to block any kind of constructive response. I just mentioned that at the outset as a way of suggesting that the agenda of the 21st century has to incorporate the ecological challenge. Otherwise, it can be preoccupied in ways that will not address the deeper problems that are going to afflict the peoples of the region. And it's very difficult to do because I find it difficult myself, and it was only while listening to my four colleagues that I realized that there was no attention given to this issue, even though we were asked to speak by our distinguished and very well-disciplined chair about whither WANA. And one direction of whither WANA is this problems that are associated with global warming, and what Mazen said about attentiveness to nature is certainly responsive to that. I had, in common with others that have spoken already, felt that in order to understand the present and talk about the future of West Asia, one had to first have some sense about what I would call the legacies, the harmful legacies of West centrism, which has afflicted the region as much as any other region with a possible exception of sub-Saharan Africa. And I would modify Chandra's opening remarks to the extent of saying that sub-Saharan Africa has suffered as much from the colonial legacy as has West Asia. And because others have already referred to this, I will just very quickly indicate my own way of thinking about these legacies. And it seems to me that there are four main ways of conceptualizing what West centrism brought, which essentially is colonialism, interventionism, and resource exploitation. And it did so, these time situating influences, causal influences in history is always somewhat arbitrary, but along with others, the two developments in the period of the World War I so-called peace diplomacy, the Sykes-Picot Agreement and the Balfour Declaration, were perhaps a part of the last hurrah of colonialism, but they also had, as declining political orders often do, they become most destructive in their terminal phases. I'm not sure if I can do a medical analogy to what, but he maybe can give us a diagnosis for terminal illness. But what happened after World War I, creating artificial political communities that corresponded with colonial convenience and colonial ambition, and were insensitive to the religious, ethnic, cultural, and historical experience of the peoples of the region. And then to give this kind of colonialist mandate to Zionism as a legitimate form of nationalism. I mean, the real effort of the Balfour Declaration was to legitimize an aggressive nationalism that was not rooted in the experience of people living within the political, the geographic community itself. And of course, as that generates resistance, intervention, and all the horrors that have followed. And part of the legacy of creating artificial political communities is that they can only be governed by autocracy. They can't, because they're artificial, they have to be held together by brute force. And if they're not held together by brute force, you have chaos. And I've often said in the aftermath of the Iraq intervention by the United States that I'm sure the planners in the Pentagon dream at night of a second coming of Saddam Hussein, because that's so much better from the American strategic point of view than the chaos that has ensued. Same thing in Libya. Intervention doesn't produce stability, much less democracy. What it produces at its best is chaos. And there's a very prevalent saying in the Middle East that people prefer 100 years of tyranny to a single year of chaos. See, and that notion of democracy promotion in a context of this sort that was generated by that diplomacy 100 years ago is part of the explanation of the tragedy that we witness and try to reflect upon. The second level is the end of this Cold War, which instead of being used as a moment of historical fluidity within which a real peace initiative could have been established, it was used to to satisfy essentially Israel's regional agenda and to solidify, to the extent possible, access to Gulf oil and energy resources generally in the region. In other words, it wasn't taken. One of the characteristics of the Westphalian system is that the opportunities for peace are at the end of major wars. And the Cold War was a major war. And yet, unlike World War I, where the League of Nations, and World War II, where UN were established, the victors, so-called, in the Cold War had no political imagination about how to take advantage of that moment of peace. And instead, what they did was to promote neoliberal globalization and the Israeli agenda, which was one of making sure that no viable states exist in the region. In other words, a regional geopolitics of destabilization, which we see, again, the evidence of at the present time. Then the third level, I think the third kind of legacy is the impact on the region of the 9/11 attacks on the United States. And instead of at least questioning the special relationship with Saudi Arabia after that happened, instead that relationship was reinforced. And it was reinforced also by treating Israel as the mentor for the conduct of counter-terrorist warfare. And not only counter-terrorist warfare, but training American police in handling issues of race and tension within American communities. So in a peculiar kind of way, the way in which state terror is carried out in the Middle East was brought home to America through this imitation of Israeli policing, and taking to heart Sharon's well-known statement after 9/11 that Arafat is our Osama bin Laden, which was, it seemed so absurd to someone familiar with the issues, but it was taken as a reinforcement from a grand strategy point of view of the relationship between the United States and Israel, that they confronted essentially the same kind of enemies and they needed the same kind of tactics in order to establish security and stability. And it is a probably unprecedented reality in international relations that a country as seemingly small as Israel should become the mentor of this global leviathan, the United States. But in matters of 21st century conflict, that has really developed, that Israel is the pedagogical master of counter-terrorist tactical strategy. And the fourth legacy comes in relation to the aftermath of Tahrir Square and the Arab uprisings of 2011, which seemed for a brief moment to be so promising in their potential. But what was not understood and anticipated was the counter-revolutionary ambition of those external actors and internal forces that didn't want democracy or some kind of more consensual and equitable relationship between people and the state. And that again brought Saudi Arabia, Israel, and the United States into this unholy alliance that welcomed the counter-revolutionary aftermath and was quite comfortable with either intervention or chaos. See, because that corresponded to the Israeli idea of keeping the region preoccupied with issues other than Palestine. See, if you ask the question, how do you get the governments and the publics of the region not to think about this most fundamental issue, what Nelson Mandela already identified as the great moral challenge of our time in the post-apartheid, post-South African apartheid world. That failure to grasp this kind of reality, that what the U.S. Grand strategy has ended up with is support for the monarchies and destabilization of the others. And now, like many policies that go wrong, they're trying to find some kind of way of reeling back the mistake. The refugee issue, from a grand strategy point of view, is the backlash of this destabilization regional geopolitics. And and so suddenly there's a genuine European and particularly European interest and Turkish interest in establishing some kind of stability again in the region, because that's the only way that the flow of refugees will stop. So it seems to me these four legacies are what constitute what we social scientists like to call the problematique of the region. And if in my remaining 13 minutes or whatever Chandra allows me, let me try to say something about what happens. And just if one thinks descriptively, projecting the trends of the present into the future, it is very difficult not to admire Mazen's optimism, but he must have been born with that. It certainly can't come from assessing the situation, the existential situation. Because my sense of what is in store for the region if present trends persist is, first of all, that Israel will proceed to a unilateral one-state solution of the Palestinian issue and declare the conflict over, and that there's not enough incentive on the part of the existing elites in the region or in Europe or elsewhere to challenge this outcome, that Saudi Arabia will continue to use its wealth and weapons to project a to seek maximum influence and control in the region. And if that doesn't altogether succeed because of its rivalry with Iran, it will continue to wage a sectarian war in the region, in various theaters of combat. And the US will continue to do its best to prevent self-determination in the countries of the region. And if it's challenged, as it seems to be by the Russian presence in Syria, and if America has the misfortune of electing either Hillary Clinton or even worse misfortune, probably electing a Republican in 2016, then a second Cold War is very likely to spiral out of the difficulties in the Middle East. And all of this, as I said at the very outset, is against this background where the region will be increasingly, even against its will, confronted by the real impact of global warming. It won't be able to escape it, despite it will become a local issue as well as a global and regional issue. Now, if one tries to think prescriptively rather than in this pessimistic descriptive way, then I think we can call attention to several of the positive potentialities, some of which have been, I think, well identified in the presentation of my co-panelist, Professor Brickmont. And I think he's correct that there are these changes in the subjectivity with which the Israel-Palestine issue is viewed, in relation to the special relationship to Israel. Perhaps, in my most optimistic moments, I think that the greatest benefit of the Iran nuclear agreement is to undermine the special relationship between the United States and Israel and to weaken the power of AIPAC in the United States, because it's the first time that there's been a real repudiation or apparent repudiation. It's more deceptive. It's very deceptive in some ways, because in order to assuage the supposed wounds of Israel, they'll be given additional military equipment. There will be additional foreign economic assistance, of which they certainly don't need. But I think one can see these, and certain restlessness in the United States itself. Some people optimistically, Chris Hedges for one, talk about a pre-revolutionary situation. And on my best dreams endorse that view. And then I agree with Mazen and others that there is a very encouraging rise in support for international support for the Palestinian struggle, a sense of solidarity with Palestinian resistance that is epitomized by the BDS campaign. And because it's being successful, it's producing a very nasty, angry kind of Zionist backlash that is particularly directed at universities and trying to punish those that have a certain sense of decency in relation to how they view the conflict and are critical of Israel. You pay a price at this point for being in visible solidarity with the Palestinian struggle. And that's, as I say, both an indication of the success, the rise of civil society as a genuine ally of the Palestinian struggle, and the backlash of Zionist forces that are increasingly on the defensive, and for that reason take these very unpleasant ways of reacting. And then I think what, again, hasn't been discussed, and I don't have any time, I think the most positive initial step to producing a new regional atmosphere would be an insistence on the total denuclearization of the region. And that would mean the mobilization, challenging the right of Israel to have a nuclear monopoly, nuclear weapons monopoly in the region. As matters now stand, because of the special relationship and the U.S. Geopolitical leverage, it's not even discussable. I mean, the outrage of requiring Iran to make these extraordinary adjustments while Israel covertly acquires and develops its own arsenal of nuclear weapons, and it has engaged in several wars outside its borders. Iran, for several hundred years, has not used force beyond its borders. So this anomaly seems to me should be challenged. And if it were challenged, it would signal a whole new way of addressing the security of the region and the stability of the region. And it could lead, in my view, to the kind of collective framing of relations within the region that our first speaker, Mr. Alawi, so vividly portrayed. And as I tried to convey to him, I don't think the Congress of Vienna is the way to promote his proposal, because it, again, invites a West-centric perception that we have to learn from Europe rather than learning from other parts of the world. Now, I'd like it better if it was called a second Bandung initiative, or something that got away from the notion that nothing good can happen in the world unless it's somehow based on a European antecedent experience. But I think that he is absolutely correct, that the way to overcome the interplay of artificial political communities that exist in the region and the suppressed peoples like the Kurds that are struggling for their own human rights and self-determination is to create, at the earliest possible time, a regional framework that is not, I also would not agree with the invitation to the external actors like Russia and the US to participate, or China to participate. It must be authentically and autonomously regional undertaking. And I think it can't happen until you get rid of this nuclear hegemony that Israel exercises. And if Israel can be forced to give up its nuclear monopoly, then I think there's a broader climate receptive to accommodation. And I see that as maybe a direction that the Rhodes Forum can also encourage. How do we create the political climate where a regional confederation, maybe the future of West Asia, is a regional confederation that recognizes political communities other than sovereign states in the Westphalian model. And I think it would really be worth exploring that kind of vision, which builds on what Mr. Alawi set before us, but I think goes in a slightly different direction that may appall him if he responds to it. I'm sure I'm close to my 27 minutes, am I? Another minute. Well, I hope I haven't put too many people to sleep during this last of the five presentations. And I do think that we should begin to think eco-politically in the 21st century. If we want, let me put it in a very grandiose way in my final minute, maybe you shouldn't have given me that minute, that we need to think and act eco-politically if we want the species to survive. Whether the species has a will to survive is far from established. Let me stop there.